So in order to understand the debate that has been provoked by the Treasury Secretary and Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen's announcement that the U.S. government would step in as leading Silicon Valley venture capitalists spent the last several days demanding that it do, and protect to 100% every penny of all depositors' funds in the now collapsing Silicon Valley Bank, as well as at least one other bank that is also collapsing rapidly, on which Barney Frank, ironically the longtime Democratic congressman who, along with Senator Chris Dodd, authored the legislation after the 2008 financial crisis that was designed to prevent exactly this from happening again. As it turns out, Barney Frank happens to sit on the board of the bank that is the second bank to fail as part of this bank run, meaning his legislation did not evidently fulfill its promise of preventing a systemic contamination and essentially a threat of a financial collapse from happening again, as it happened right under his own nose at his own bank. Now, in order to understand the debate, and it's a complex debate and one that requires expertise, which I am the first to acknowledge I do not possess, which is why we're going to have a guest on tonight who does, who has one view, and a guest tomorrow night who also does, who has the other. It's very important to remember and understand the 2008 financial crisis and the context of that debate, and that I do feel very comfortably speaking on because I covered it extensively at the time as a journalist. It involved not only complex financial instruments, but also the political dynamics that shape our country. That financial crisis was a long time in the making. It was something that people were able to predict and actually did predict. Increasingly, Wall Street was able to invest in very, very complex and opaque economic instruments that were highly risky, and like all risky instruments, had a high amount of profit. They were able to invest in that because of the rollback of various financial protections that came in the wake of the Great Depression in the early 1930s that were designed to keep separate commercial banking activities that are generally more conservative and risk averse from riskier investment activities that tend to be riskier. And the idea was to prevent a systemic collapse in the commercial banking sector that led to the Great Depression in the first place. And over the years, especially the Clinton administration and their genius economists like Larry Summers and those types, Robert Rubin, right from Goldman Sachs, decided that these protections from the FDR era were obsolete and banks could be unchained in order to start to become much riskier. And they were heavily rewarded because the Wall Street sector and the banking sector began investing heavily in and funding heavily the Democratic Party as a result of the Democratic Party's servitude to the banking industry. They had a lot of Republican support as well during the Clinton administration with all these rollbacks. And that led to the ability of all kinds of banks with your money, depositor money, to be able to engage in much riskier types of investments. And one of the investment schemes that they particularly liked were called mortgage-backed securities, which was when banks would offer loans to people to buy houses and would keep the houses as collateral. And the very high value of the real estate market ensured that those mortgage-backed securities, which are all grouped together, had a great deal of value and could be traded as commodities. Unfortunately, when the real estate market and the real estate bubble collapsed, the value of those mortgage-backed securities collapsed with them, and that led to an unraveling, a very rapid unraveling of almost all of Wall Street, starting in September and October of 2008. So during the last several months of the Bush administration, when the Treasury Secretary still was Hank Paulson, who before joining the Bush administration as Treasury Secretary had been the CEO of Goldman Sachs, very much from a Wall Street background. And his argument was, Treasury Secretary Paulson's, was that we need to act immediately to save the financial markets with a gigantic infusion of credit and cash in order to protect the credit markets from collapsing. And what a lot of people don't remember is that the very first proposal that was negotiated between the Bush White House, as the 2008 presidential election between Obama and McCain, John McCain, was approaching, with congressional leaders, including John Boehner, the then House Speaker, and Nancy Pelosi, the then House Minority Leader and the head of the Democratic Party. Both of them were on board. The establishment wings of both parties were on board with Hank Paulson's plan to give a gigantic infusion of $800 billion into the Wall Street sector to prevent it from collapsing. The warnings were just as grave, in fact, way graver than the ones we're hearing now, that if the government doesn't immediately act to save these Wall Street institutions, the entire system will collapse. There will be bank runs. Nobody will trust these institutions any longer. Everyone will try and take their money out of the system. And not just the US financial system, but the global financial system will collapse. Now, that crisis was much greater in scale than the current one, at least so far. But the arguments are very similar. Obviously, there was a lot of resentment that the US government was going to bail out the titans of capitalism. After all, the whole idea of capitalism is the reason that you get rich is because you make bets, risky bets, and if you're right, you get rich. But that only works if you also then lose everything when you're wrong. And yet what happened here was they all made very risky bets. They got rich when they were right. And then when they were wrong, instead of losing, which is the other side of capitalism, which has to be the other side of capitalism, instead the US government intervened, stepped in, and said, oh, don't worry, we're going to back you up. We're going to give you a gigantic infusion of cash to prevent the system from collapsing. And even though it generated a lot of anger, why should the richest people in the world who caused the crisis in the first place with their recklessness be protected with taxpayer-funded money? It nonetheless happened because the argument prevailed that if we didn't protect the richest people on the planet who caused the financial collapse, that all of us would suffer because the entire financial system would collapse. And there was an infusion of $700 billion or $800 billion that was nowhere near enough to calm the markets. And then once President Obama was in office, he selected Timothy Geithner as his Treasury Secretary, who was most known for being an incredibly loyal servant to Wall Street. They infused a lot more money into Wall Street, and Wall Street and its casino went on. And then the Dodd-Frank legislation was the promise of the American people to say we're going to reform everything so this never happens again. The argument was, look, these institutions are too big to fail. We cannot allow them to fail. We're allowed to watch them succeed and get rich when they're right, but when they're wrong, we can't let them fail. And that created a lot of resentment, political resentment. That first bill that was sponsored by Hank Paulson, that was negotiated with John Boehner and Nancy Pelosi, the first time it came up for a vote in the House, it actually failed, despite warnings that its failure would cause the implosion of the global economic system. And it failed because a majority of Republicans on the right voted no, as did, I believe, up to 90 Democrats, most of whom were from the left wing of the party. And on the day the US government refused, through the vote in the House, to intervene in the markets, the US stock market lost something like 8% of its value. Other stock markets around the world lost 10% of its value, and there was real panic, which is why they finally ended up coercing enough members of both political parties to change their vote to yes and start infusing huge amounts of money into that system. And it did end up saving Wall Street, but the funds that were set aside to help homeowners and working class people and middle class people were basically ignored. Huge numbers of them were evicted from their homes, lost their homes in foreclosure, and people to this very day are drowning in debt, generational debt, because of that financial crisis. So that is absolutely the context for this debate. Namely, is this a repeat of the 2008 financial crisis? Not necessarily yet, to the extent that it's of that magnitude, but that the political dynamic is the same. Namely, all of these libertarian, keep the government out of our lives, anti-socialist, tech billionaires in Silicon Valley who hate socialism, who hate the idea that the government steps in and helps people who are poor. Those poor people should be self-sufficient. They don't need government help. The minute their bank and their money is at risk, they start pounding the table to be saved. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update. Catch our full shows for free, live weekdays at 7 p.m. Eastern on Rumble, and join our locals community at greenwald.locals.com for all of my written journalism, exclusive after-show Q&As, and more.